Okay, paper for today, and our last paper that we will cover on the biomechanics of squatting is one on an important issue in squatting, and that's the depth of the squat. Squatting to, say, a parallel depth versus a deep depth versus a shallower depth. The biomechanics of that, and kind of the trade-offs of what's being lost when you squat to different depths, or what's happening when you do different depths of squats. To motivate that, let's look at two high-level squatters here, and at two different depths. This first video is Dmitry Klokov. He's one of the best Olympic weightlifters in the world, and here's him doing a very deep front squat with well over 500 pounds on the bar here. Pretty long pause here, which is also quite impressive. So very deep squat there, and that's one of the things that the front squat, having the barbell on the front of your chest rather than on your back, helps to facilitate there, as you can typically get into a deeper squat and can keep the trunk more upright while you're squatting. But a very deep squat there, and then let's compare that to a heavier but less deep squat here by Eddie Cohn. Ed is not. It's debatable, who's the greatest power lifter of all time, but he's certainly one of the few figures in that conversation. He's just very much one of the best power lifters of all time, if not the greatest power lifter of all time. And here's him in competition doing a 931-pound squat. So much heavier than Klokov's lift, but not quite as deep, and with considerably more trunk flexion there. Now, these are two different athletes in two different sports. So we should probably, the first one is an Olympic weightlifter, and the second one is power lifter, and those are different sports with different goals. And so we should maybe expect them to use different form there. Klokov, for example, was probably doing that lift for training purposes and for muscular adaptations, whereas Cohen was doing his lift in competition. He was interested in performance for that lift, not for training. In powerlifting, you only have to get to a certain minimum depth, and it varies from like division to organization what the rules are. But a common rule is that the top of your, or the crease of your hip has to get below the top of your knee joint for the lift to count. And so he was probably just going for something like that, getting to that highest possible depth that he absolutely had to get to for the lift to count. So he wasn't interested in training or muscular stimulation or anything there. Whereas Klokov was probably more interested in training and muscular stimulation. So, but these are some of the choices that we make biomechanically when we're performing an exercise like the squat. Right? You can squat to a very shallow depth. You can squat to just very parallel. You can squat to as low as you can possibly go. Ass to grass. Pardon my language, as it's commonly called. And what are the biomechanics involved there? What are the trade-offs of going to different depths in the squat, and the effect of that at doing it with, say, a fairly lightweight like a 50% max versus a very heavy weight like a 80 or a 90% max. That's what the study for today was about here. So Bryanton et al., the effect of squat depth and barbell load on relative muscular effort in squatting. And what do they mean here by relative muscular effort? This is one of the things that I liked about this study, and the main reason why I picked this study for the class here. By relative muscular effort, they mean most studies on biomechanics in general and on weightlifting biomechanics specifically. A lot of them will do similar approaches to what they did here, where they'll do like an inverse dynamics analysis of torques on the joints during a movement like this. And so here they quantified the torque in the sagittal plane at the three main joints involved in squatting, at the hip and at the knee and at the ankle. And think back to Knies 300. In the sagittal plane for most movements involving those particular joints, if you look at the torque produced at that joint, you can pretty confidently infer something about the forces and the muscles involved in those joints. For example, if I look at the knee joint in a squat, and in two different conditions, I see a bigger knee joint moment, or bigger torque at the knee in condition A versus in condition B, where I saw a smaller moment. Based on those differences in moments, I can pretty confidently infer that it required greater forces of the quadriceps in the condition with the larger torque at the knee. Like you can infer that pretty confidently from inverse dynamics results like this. What they did here that I liked is rather than just calculating the joint moments in terms of like the raw units that we normally see moments in Newton meters or scaling them by body mass or something like that. They did the inverse dynamics analysis and got the torques at the joints in Newton meters, but then expressed them relative to that individual's maximum isometric torque that they were able to produce at that joint angle. And so what they did here is they had the athletes, and these were 10 strength trained women that they had come in here. The athletes here had, I think in the table, if I remember correctly on describing them, yeah, they had a 1 rep max squat on average of 1.3 times their body mass, which is not like a huge squat, but it's far beyond what an untrained person could possibly do. So these were, I would say, were moderately experienced individuals with weight training here. They came into the lab and they did an instrumented biomechanical analysis of their squats and calculated peak torques at the hip and then in the ankle during the squat with different weights ranging from I think 50% to a 90% maximum weight. But then they also put them on a biodex machine, a dynamometer machine, and then quantified at a range of different angles for those three joints, for the hip and the knee and the ankle, what is the peak isometric torque that you are able to produce in isolation at that joint when it's positioned in that angle. They then took the torques measured in squatting and divided them by the max isometric torques that the athletes were able to produce in isolated activation of that joint at that same angle, and then called that the relative muscular effort. You can kind of think of it as when I'm producing this torque, how much extra torque do I have in reserve, or how close am I to producing the maximum torque that I was hypothetically able to produce. So you can kind of think of this as like, how close am I to like my maximum limit here? How close was I to failing or being unable to produce the torque that I needed to produce that I actually produced here. So I like that casting of it here as being relative to the max that you were able to produce in isolation in terms of informing what's going on here with the squat. So another reason that I picked this paper is the result really does, at least for the knee, really doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I just kind of have a hard time believing this result. Now that I can't find a reason in the paper to think that they screwed it up or that there's some technical mistake that was made here, but it's a surprising result to me. And this is something that I would like you to take away from this particular study and from this class in general, is that it's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to be questionable of results that are published in scientific papers like this and wonder about that doesn't quite match up with my expectation or with my experience. You shouldn't just criticize something just because it's not what you expect or it's different from your intuition. Again, I can't find a reason here in the study that says, that's the thing that they messed up. I don't see anything here that was done incorrectly. It's just a result that is surprising to me and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and I have a difficult time convincing myself of why this is necessarily the case here. So basically what they did is they had the athletes come in and they did squats between 50 and 90% of their 1 rep maximum squat and measured their biomechanics and torques at the joints and then expressed them as the relative muscular effort here. And then they assessed the squat or assessed those torques at different kind of partitioned ranges of motion in the squat. If you read through the study here, and if you just look at the results, like for example, so here's a photo of one of the participants doing a squat to parallel versus doing their deepest possible squat. They didn't actually have the participants here do squats to different depths in all of them with all of the weights from the 50% weight up to the 90% weight. They had them squat as deep as possible, but then they assessed the squat at different amounts of flexion or different depths of squats during that motion to kind of in a roundabout way kind of emulate what you might expect to see, like if that was the deepest depth that you got to. So they actually did like full depth squats at all the weights, but then they assessed the mechanics of the squat at varying depths within that maximum depth that they actually did, if that makes sense. So they did like just one squat, but then they assessed the mechanics in terms of the torque at the joint and how close you were to your limits at varying different depths within that one single squat to kind of get an estimate of what things would be like if you had actually just done the squat to a shallower depth than you actually did it to. So what did they see here? Figure 3 presents the results for the ankle. And so you can think of this as primarily expressing the effort and the forces and torques involved from the plantar flexor muscles, the gastrocnemius and soleus primarily. Figure 4 is those same results, but for the knee, which is going to be your quadriceps, your vasti, and your rectus femoris. And figure 5 is for the hip, which is going to be primarily your gluteal muscles and to a lesser extent your hamstring muscles. Hamstrings aren't terribly active in squatting, but they still will make a small contribution here. So this is primarily going to be your glute muscles at the hip here, but the hamstrings will also be a little bit involved there. So at the ankle, which again is figure 3 here, on the left, these are kind of busy figures, so let me walk you through them here. On all of these, for all 3 of these joints, and always in the left panel and the right panel together, the y-axis is your relative muscular effort. So it's saying at this particular part of this particular squat, what was your relative muscular effort at that joint. So for example, here if it's 50%, that's saying the peak torque at the ankle, which is again in this case is going to be primarily from the plantar flexor muscles, was 50% of the maximum possible torque that this person was able to produce at that joint at that time. Okay? So that's kind of the way that we would interpret this here. So the closer it gets to 100 or the higher it gets on this axis, the closer I am to my maximum limit there, to not being able to produce any additional torque at that particular joint when it's in that particular pose. So in these figures here, on the one on the left, on the x-axis, that's showing the depth of the squat. Okay, so on the far left here, that's in the bin here of flexing the knee to 105 to 119 degrees, which is a pretty deep squat. And then as you move to the right there, that's shallower and shallower squats. So things got a little bit different at the ankle, it seemed, when they did the heaviest squat here, the 90% squat, which is this one at the top here. But for most of the other weights, for the lighter weights, it kind of looked like that the deeper they got into the squat, the greater muscular effort relative to their max was required of the ankle joint. Okay. Then on the right here is where they have it cast as the barbell load on the x-axis. So as we move to the right here, that's heavier and heavier loads on the barbell. So the 50% max on the left, going all the way up to the 90% of the max on the right here. Then the little symbols here, those were the data assessed at the different depths of the squats. So in all of these figures here, the left panel and the right panel are really showing the same data. The difference is just what's shown on the x-axis and what's indicated in the different lines here. On the left, they're showing squat depth on the x-axis and the different depths in the different weights and the different symbols there. On the right, they're showing the barbell load on the x-axis, and the symbols are indicating the different depths of the squats that they assessed the relative muscular effort at. I think the figure on the right is a little bit easier to make sense out of. So and it's also the one that for the knee shows the surprising result that I'm not expecting. And so that's the one that I'm going to focus on here. But so here for the ankle, we kind of see what you might expect. The deeper that you go, the more demanding you are on your muscles spanning the ankle there, and then the heavier that you go, the more demanding you're getting on your muscles. And that's kind of the result that you might expect here, right? Hey, want to load up your muscles as much as possible in the squat, go as deep as you can, and use the heaviest weight that you can, at least on a rep for rep basis. That's going to be the biggest demand on your muscle groups there. Now, does that make sense? Does going obviously using heavier weight for all other things being equal is probably going to require heavier muscle forces. You would think, right? That's the part on the knee that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We'll see that in a second. But that kind of matches up with what you might expect. Use a heavier weight, it's going to take greater muscular effort. The deeper that you go, it's going to take greater muscular effort. Why does that necessarily make sense? Think back to what I was talking about in the first lecture on this strength training section of class, where on the bench press we gave the example of selecting the position of your hands on the bar, and the narrower that you pick it, the greater the height that you're going to have to lift the barbell to. So you're going to have to do more work on the barbell to add that extra potential energy to lift it higher up in the air. That's essentially what's going on here when you squat to a shallower depth. For each rep there, you don't have to do as much work on the barbell because you don't have to add as much potential energy to it to complete that rep, right? It's kind of like if I have my pen here, it's easier for me to lift it up to this height than it is for me to lift it up to this height, right? I've got to add more potential energy to it to get it up to the greater height, and that takes more work from me and more work from my muscles. Okay? So that's kind of the expected result here. You go deeper, you got to do more work on the barbell. That's going to take more muscular effort here. Skip ahead here to, close your eyes here and don't look at figure 4 for a second. Skip ahead here to figure 5, which was for the hip. And again, we see basically that same result for the ankle. If I look at these different symbols here, always being the same depth of the squat, and then as I move across here on the x-axis, that being heavier loads for the squat, regardless of the depth that things were assessed at, if you added a heavier load, that required more muscular effort. And as you went deeper and deeper into the squat, that required more muscular effort. So if I did, the most shallow squat, for example, with the 50% load, that only required about 20% of my capacity for my hip extensors. Whereas if I did that same load down to the deepest possible squat at 100, 120 degrees, that required 60% muscular effort. Right? So that's a good demonstration of just how much effect this depth of squat can have. That's a very large change in depth. Like 30 degrees for a squat, you'd be one of those folks that ends up in videos making fun of people on YouTube. Hey, if you're only doing 30 degrees on a squat, you're like barely moving. That's not very much. Whereas 119, 120, that's a fairly deep squat for most people. A lot of people may not even have the flexibility to get into that pose. So it shouldn't really be surprising that that's such a large difference in muscular effort, but it is just kind of remarkable just what a tremendous difference that form can make. You're almost like tripling how much effort it took from your hip extensor muscles there with the depth of the squat there for the same weight on the barbell there. So then we also see that, or I may have already said this already, but heavier load that you get, more effort required for the muscles, and the deeper you go in the squat, the more effort required of the muscles. So again, the result that we expect to see there. Now, last time I yammered on quite a bit about how the squat, at least for the form that most people use for most purposes, for squats, for muscular training and stimulation purposes, yeah, it involves the hip and the ankle, but the squat for most people is primarily a quadriceps exercise. Most people are using the squat exercise to induce an adaptation of their lower body in general, yes, but primarily of the quadriceps. It's generally a motion that primarily targets the quadriceps muscles. But the result here for the knee really just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Okay, so here's the same results that we saw for the ankle and for the hip, but this time calculated for the knee. And if we just look at any one of these barbell loads, so let's just look at the 50% one here. Okay, there again you see the expected result. The deeper that you go in your squat, the greater the muscular effort required, and it's about a little bit over of a doubling effect. So the shallowest possible squat there took about 25% of your capacity at your quadriceps, whereas up to the deepest one, it took over 50%, maybe 60% on average of your capacity at your quadriceps muscles there. The part here that doesn't make a lot of sense to me is notice how consistent these magnitudes are across the weight of the barbell here. So this is saying that between lifting a 50%, doing a 50% lift on the squat and a 90% lift on the squat, that required statistically the same muscular effort at your quadriceps muscles with a 50% barbell load versus a 90% barbell load. I just have a real hard time believing that that is correct in reality. Again, I don't see anything in the study that suggests that they messed that up somehow. That just doesn't seem like it's possible to me that I'm using the same fraction of my muscular effort of my quadriceps regardless of the load that I have on the barbell here. Again, I can't find anything in this study that explains like some sort of technical flaw or some sort of design. It looks to me like it was a well designed and well executed study. This is just a surprising result to me, so I'm not sure. It doesn't make sense to me why that's the result, and I'm a little frustrated that I can't find, oh, here's the thing that causes that to not be the case. So maybe it's me that's wrong. Maybe this is just my perception that, oh, when I'm lifting heavier and heavier weights, I'm demanding more and more of my quadriceps. Maybe I'm not, and that could be an important take-home message. That could say, hey, do you want to increase the total stress on your quadriceps? Well, progressing the weight may not necessarily do that. You're going to have to progress the reps that you do with that weight. That's one thing that you might take away from a result like this. Again, I'm skeptical of this result. This just doesn't, in my personal experience, this just doesn't seem like it's correct in reality, that I put the same relative effort on my quadriceps with a 50% load versus a 90% load. But maybe it's me that's wrong. Here's some data saying, well, no, you're actually not correct there. So good things to keep in mind. It's okay to be skeptical of scientific studies, but it's also okay to have your intuitions and your beliefs challenged here by scientific studies that show data indicating that maybe you're not correct here. A point that they make here in terms of kind of tying this into relevance here for training, and it's fairly early on here in the discussion. They say, as a function of the size principle, large tensions, approximately 80% MVC or higher, are required to recruit and train all high threshold motor units. If you've taken Kines 385, or maybe in one of the anatomy and physiology classes, I'm not sure if they cover this in there necessarily, you probably heard about something called the Henneman size principle, and I believe I had this pulled up here on the old Wikipedia. Henneman size principle. This is the idea that when humans are producing muscular force, we don't activate like all of our motor units all at once. We tend to recruit them in this sequential fashion, and especially for isometric contractions, they tend to be recruited in this sequential fashion. For weightlifting, of course, we're not doing isometric contractions. Most of the time we're doing dynamic contractions, but for slow, heavy lifts, like a heavy squat, like whole body heavy lifts, like a squat like this, for example, they're typically fairly slow motions, and we're not isometric, but it's still pretty slow. And so the general principles of something like this, which was developed from data on isometric contractions, might hold, at least in principle, or at least in a qualitative sense. So the Henneman size principle here is the idea that as I ramp up my force in my muscles that I'm producing from a low force gradually up to a high maximum force, I recruit my motor units in a fairly stereotypical fashion there. And just for some review, if it's been a while since you've seen these things and seen these terms, what is a motor unit? A motor unit is the alpha motor neuron from the nervous system and all of the muscle fibers that motor unit innervates. So the muscle fibers that motor unit will be, passing action potentials to actually recruit and activate that muscle fiber and produce force with it. Small motor units are ones with, small diameter motor neurons that recruit a fairly small number of muscle fibers, and those muscle fibers tend to be the slow twitch muscle fibers. When the larger the motor units get, the larger and larger, diameter neurons they get, they tend to innervate a larger total number of muscle fibers, and those muscle fibers tend to be the faster twitch motor units. So if you want to kind of partition these into a yes, no, or kind of a binary thing, there's small motor units, which are mostly slow twitch, and there's large motor units, which are mostly fast twitch, and we recruit them in that order. As I'm producing low muscle force, I recruit first the smallest and slowest motor units, and then as I ramp up that force up to, say, a low effort contraction, grading it up to a higher effort contraction, or say a lightweight squat up to a heavier and heavier squat, then I recruit progressively larger and larger and faster motor units to do that. Reasons for that are debatable. I suspect it's probably related to like endurance and fatigue resistance, and possibly something related to energy conservation. The faster muscle fibers tend to be less efficient, less economical to use them than the slower muscle fibers. Like if you're going to produce a given amount of work, you can do that more efficiently in terms of metabolic energy expended with a slower twitch motor unit than with a faster twitch motor unit. So we could recruit the slower twitch ones early on because they're the ones that are going to be more efficient to use. Then I want to use those motor units because I know they're slower, yes, but they're have more endurance. They're more fatigue resistant. I can keep them active at that force level for a longer amount of time. But then I only add in the faster ones when I realize, oh, okay, you're asking me to produce more force here. I've got to actually recruit some larger and faster motor units to get up to that force. But I'm going to only use those when I have to because I know that they're less fatigue resistant. They're gonna exhaust themselves quicker and they're less efficient to use. So I'm gonna keep them in reserve until I really need them because I know I can't use them for very long and they're not very efficient. At least that's one of the theories on why we have this size principle in our neuromuscular control. I'm leaving out a great deal of details there on decades of research in motor control and neurophysiology, but that's kind of the quick 2-minute summary of the Henneman size principle there. So that's relevant here because they comment that there's data showing that if you want to recruit and train and stress all of your motor units, like the smallest and slowest ones up to the largest and fastest ones. If you want to recruit and stress all of those, it takes a large amount of force on your muscles to get to a force level big enough to actually trigger recruitment of all those motor units. Anywhere from like 80 to 85, I've even said 90% of your maximum voluntary muscle force is the threshold you have to get to there to actually recruit all of those motor units. So suggesting that data like this could help infer that, like what depth do I have to get to and what load do I have to use on the barbell to actually get to a level that I'm recruiting the motor units that I want to recruit for my particular purpose. An endurance runner, for example, might be primarily concerned with or might be okay with not necessarily stressing those faster, larger motor units, whereas a sprinter, for example, that is going to be more dependent on those faster and stronger motor units for performance in their sport might be more interested in placing a high load and a high training stimulus on those faster and more fatigable motor units. Okay, that is all for today.